This was the life. They had arrived. Business was booming. There were deals to be had. Everybody who was anybody was there. There was the new rich, the old rich, and of course the stars were there. A lot of new somebodies were there. They were dancing their nights away as if there were no tomorrows. At least, none worth worrying about.
But there was one tomorrow fated to come, which would change everyone's destiny. Early Tuesday morning, October 29th, 1929, the stock market opened, just as it had for the last 20 years. The trading floor was a frenzy of activity, except on this day, all the trade orders were to sell, not buy. But not even the experts suspected the devastating crash that would become known as the Great Depression. Not only did it dramatically change the lives of all Americans, but it affected the lives of millions more around the world. Once prominent traders and wealthy businessmen jumped to their deaths from multi-story buildings. Hard-working people lost their life savings, businesses, homes, and jobs. Thousands of millionaires became mere statistics in the fast-growing ranks of the unemployed. The middle class virtually disappeared. By the end of the year, the market lost the unbelievable sum of $40 billion in equity. 3 years later, at the depth of the Depression, the national income fell by 50%. 5,000 banks closed their doors. The degree of universal pain and suffering prompted President Franklin Roosevelt to take action which would once have been considered illegal. The Founding Fathers had been firm on the fact that the government was never to interfere with the free enterprise system. But Roosevelt boldly initiated his New Deal, and for the first time in U.S. history, the government provided help, called entitlements for the needy. The stage was set for the federal government to dominate American business, banking, commerce, and the economy as a whole. It was the promise of acquiring prosperity built on borrowing without the ability to repay, which had tempted normally conservative Americans to risk all they owned before the crash. In 1928, there was no venture too risky to invest in. There had been a few prophetic voices that warned of impending financial disaster because of the accumulated debt, yet their words were dismissed as just so much gloom and doom. This was America. This was the strongest nation on earth. Ironically, the cure for the Depression was built on another kind of debt, much broader in scope: government debt. Little did President Roosevelt and subsequent politicians who followed suit know it would incur such crippling and long-range consequences. Consequences which would be more devastating to the nation than the Great Depression itself. Today, the Great Depression is simply a painful memory for those who survived it, and perhaps a matter of historical interest. The Dow Jones Industrial Average makes the news every day, and the stocks rise and fall as usual. But as America begins its entry into the 21st century, could it be that it is once again on the verge of another Great Depression? This time one that would plummet the world's greatest power to the status of a poverty-stricken nation.
Thousands of angry depositors mobbed Security Federal today as their doors closed for the last time. Security Federal is the 97th bank to collapse since last Thursday's stock market crash. The FDIC has announced it will not be able to insure any of the accounts. Bank President
55,000 employees lost their jobs today as Microtech, one of the few remaining American-owned manufacturing companies, sold out to a Japanese firm. The Natsuki Corporation announced it would immediately relocate the production facilities to Mexico City. The announcement came as a shock to employees.
Estimates of damages from Hurricane Franco, which swept through Florida's midsection last week, have reached a record high of $65 billion. For the first time in U.S. history, government aid will not be available due to the severe economic
The death toll has soared to over 600 as rioting continues to escalate in the nation's 3 largest cities. Law enforcement agencies in New York, Los Angeles, and Chicago have been unable to gain control, citing severe government cutbacks as the cause.
love this country, and it's with great pain I come to the reality. It's over. The America you and I grew up to understand in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s is a thing of the past.
We face the possibility of a depression that could make the Depression of 1929 look like a mild recession by comparison. Just think about it. Your job, your occupation, your industry, how much more dependent is it on every other job and industry in our economy right now? Far more so than in 1929.
We're going to have a collapse, meaning that it won't be a 10-year cycle like we had during the Great Depression. And understand that we aren't the same caliber nation that we were during the Great Depression.
If our government continues to spend more than it takes in, I predict with 100% certainty it will go broke.
We have a government that is able to generate $1.2 trillion per year in taxes, but it's taking $1.4 to $1.5 trillion a year for them to live. And they're literally every year borrowing money just to make interest payments on the money they've already borrowed.
Each year, the federal government spends more money than they raise in taxes. In 1992, the government had to borrow almost a quarter of all the money it spent. This amount that was borrowed is what is referred to as the deficit. Since the mid-60s, the government has been operating this way, and the grand total of all the deficits incurred over the years is called the national debt. By the end of 1992, the national debt was estimated at over $4 trillion. The government has given up trying to pay back the actual national debt and is struggling to keep up with just the interest payments. Experts project that within a few years, the interest payments alone on the national debt will absorb all the taxes collected. At this point, no money will be left to actually run the country, and America will be bankrupt.
As we continue to increase the national debt each year, we will soon be paying more and more money in interest on that national debt. Right now, interest is one of the top 3 expenditures in the national budget each year, and it will eventually, in a very few years, become the largest item in the budget. Interest which is paid out and for which no governmental benefits are provided or services provided to our citizens.
If we could balance our budget, and I know that stretches the imagination, but if our budget was balanced, we're still in trouble because we don't have the cash flow to pay the interest on our existing debt, which means we borrow to pay the interest on the existing debt, which means that existing debt is compounding on its own right.
Like a business or like an individual, if we continue to spend more than we're taking in, we're headed for what ultimately could be economic collapse as far as the government's concerned.
The United States was originally designed to operate on a pay-as-you-go basis. If it needed to spend more, it raised taxes or tariffs to generate the income. The only time the government borrowed to cover any substantial portion of its expenses was in time of war. All that changed in the 1960s.
When John F. Kennedy was inaugurated as president, federal spending and federal revenues were less than $100 billion a year. The deficit was $3 billion a year.
In November 1963, when President Kennedy was shot, our country took a turn that we failed to recognize. President Johnson declared war on poverty, war on Vietnam, and began borrowing money to achieve those goals at record rates.